Thank you. Well, thank you so much for including me in this conference. It's a real pleasure to be here, to reconnect with many old friends and to discover a lot of new people. I've been a little bit out of sort because Frank and I had a very close colleague who died 2 days ago. So I want to mention her name. I don't know how many of you know her, but she died at the age of 46 with a 5-year-old, so it's been difficult. My plan was to talk to you about How Professors Think, which is now a very old book. It goes back to 2009, and it's a book on peer review and on the culture of excellence that emerges through the deliberation process of people who serve on a very competitive fellowship board where deliberations are conducted. And this is a book where I developed a sociology of evaluation that forefronts the importance of emotion and the self of the evaluators and their belief in the customary rules that need to be respected in the process of evaluation. I was going to talk to you about how this research was extended through case studies in various countries to see how this culture of evaluation depends on the very specific conditions that this evaluative culture exists in the American context, with a great many institutions, with spatial distance. The United States is not France. The level of network interconnection between people who serve on these panels is very different. And, you have China, where party officials are sitting on tenure committees, etc. And in order to do this presentation, I was going to draw on 2 papers that have already been published, and then I realized some of you are in the room and heard me give one of the paper in Lausanne several years ago. So I thought, no, I'm not going to, embarrass myself and present a paper that has existed. But there were themes there that are very much connected with the neo-institutionalist paradigm, particularly concerning the scripts of self that are diffused through this evaluative culture, and often pits excellence and meritocracy against diversity and inclusion. But then I thought this is a moment in the United States that is just extremely complicated. As we talk among ourselves, colleagues, basically everyone is extremely depressed. It is just a moment where people are grappling for sources of hope. And yesterday at the cocktail hour, I was talking with Huggy, and we started talking about American higher education, universities, as cultural engines of hope for our graduate students and our undergrads. So I decided I'm going to talk about this instead, because it's very much connected to a talk that I just gave. And I decided to basically switch my plan. And where does the plan come? It comes from having read this book, How Democracy Dies, which is co-authored by 2 of my colleagues at Harvard, Daniel Ziblatt and Steve Levitsky. And this is an extremely important book that has been at the very top of the bestseller list of the New York Times for months. And these are experts of authoritarianism in Latin America and Europe. And they simply decided to mobilize all the knowledge that they have about how democracy dies to try to influence what's happening in American politics today. And the fact that the book has been read so widely is really an indicator of how important really providing this knowledge was. And I thought us as sociologists, we know a lot of stuff too, that should be out there on the public sphere, in the public place. And I thought, okay, I'm a cultural sociologist. I pretend to know how culture works. So I'm going to try to think about what are the parts of the puzzle, the ways in which American society appears to be facing this amazing dead end, and what are the ways in which we may be able to mobilize our knowledge to try to influence. And that's how I thought that, okay, let's figure out how the cultural repertoires through which we assess the worth of people is put together, and how can we go about changing it? Because I think a lot of the problems that we have today, the fact that Donald Trump is viewed as a hero by so many, speaks to our scripts of worth, which are basically pretty screwed up. So I put together this talk. which I gave last week at LSE, titled From Having to Being, Self-Worth and the Current Crisis of American Society. And yes, it is a totally normative talk, which those of you who have known me for 30 years know that this is not normally what I'm doing, but I've decided to do it given the current moment. And this is a talk that builds directly on the presidential address that I delivered to the American Sociological Association in August 2007, which was titled Addressing Recognition Gap, Destigmatization, and the Reduction of Inequality. And the idea is that since so much of the literature on inequality focuses on distribution of resources, we now need to think also about recognition as the other side of inequality that has not been studied sufficiently systematically as an empirical project. And it's what this paper proposed to do in order to understand how to broaden cultural citizenship to the largest numbers in American society. And I believe that one of the key problems that we're facing today is very much that in a context of growing inequality, we are facing a major failure of the American dream. All of us sociologists know that this was always basically a narrative, but a narrative that worked amazingly well for most of the 20th century, bringing many immigrants to this country, feeding the amazing root of American higher education. But while fewer and fewer people are actually able to live this American dream, it continues to feed the imaginations of citizens every day. And social scientists are very busy, people like Raj Chetty, who just left Stanford, to figure out how can more people fit into this American dream, how can we cut the pieces of the pie differently so that more people can eat pie. I think that instead what we need to do is say, no, the American dream is a total bankrupt dream, and we need to invent new narratives of hope. So this basically, a lot of this talk is about, on the one hand, providing a diagnosis to show how the American dream is just not working. And the second part is about solutions and how to diffuse new scripts of worth. And that's where the new institutionalist paradigm becomes very handy to me. And that's why I decided to prepare to change my talk to be able to talk to you, because you guys can really help me with this. So I have a few solutions, but I'm still working. I'm finishing the version of the talk that is to be published in the next month. So, really, if you have ideas, I'm going to present a few ideas, but I really welcome your input on this. So the objective is really to figure out how to generate new narratives of hope to feed social resilience. And here I draw on the work of medical anthropologist Catherine Panther-Briggs, who studied children in the refugee camps of Lebanon, and who shows that those who are most resilient are those who are able to develop intersubjective understandings that are shared with one significant other about hope. So we know that the literature on hope and resilience very much connects this meaning-making capacity, and people like you and me were equipped to understand how this may happen. So therefore, let's think about this. The broader context is the context of neoliberalism, which I studied with a group of co-authors with whom I've been meeting every year for three times. And we focus on neoliberalism through various dimensions, but I've mostly, as a cultural sociologist, been concerned with the scripts of the self, inspired here in part by John Mayer's work. So this is the book that we published in 2013. And in there, we talk about the neoliberal scripts of the self, which focus on self-resilience, competitiveness, material success, and social status, which is incarnated in this current moment by Trump. So we know that neoliberalism as a trope has gained enormous influence, especially in the last few years. Here you have, Nexus Lexus Church, and you can see how extremely dominant it becomes over very recent years. At the same time, what the paper does is, on the one hand, show that in a context of growing inequality, everyone loses, even the top 20%, our children, because as people like Mitchell Stevens and others who study higher education in this room know, we have a massive, sorry for the typos there, mental health crisis in the upper middle class. The children are using mental health services in the universities at an unbelievable, level of frequency. When we look at their level of anxiety is higher than that of inner city youth. There's a very high level of substance abuse, and the causes, Sonia Luthar does an extensive review of that literature. Some are much more updated than this one, that really ties this crisis with the pressures of, overachievement that these kids face since their parents are totally freaked out, especially since 2008, about the threat of downward mobility. So the book argues that the winners of the upper middle class are not winners at all. You have a decline of fertility since 2008. People of the upper middle class don't have as many babies, and they say it's because we don't have enough money. Can you believe it? And then we have the mental health crisis in the youth as much as with adults, and this wealth does not translate in satisfaction, but in feeling of being overworked and exhausted. And it doesn't look better in the other classes. The working class, I studied this in my 2002 book, and have done since some update on this. Basically, they felt like losers when I did the interviews for this book in '93. They feel even more like losers today. So this American dream is not working for anyone. And of course, the poor are increasingly being pushed into extreme poverty, and they are so deeply stigmatized that no one acknowledges how deeply stigmatized they are. So that's only half of the problem. The other half is a hardening of group boundaries toward blacks, toward Latinos, toward illegal immigrants. I know that Chicky has done work on this. I'm particularly curious about his reaction to these kinds of figures that show downturn in feelings of warmth toward blacks, Hispanics, especially among the Republicans and the independents. You see it also for illegal immigrants. The one group that escapes it is LGBTQ, but if we compare Republicans and Democrats, we see that, in fact, there's still a lot of polarization toward LGBTQs. So this very much corresponds to the current diagnosis about the public sphere, which is that this is what our public sphere looks like. We have the two silos, the progressive and the Republicans that don't talk to each other. So what are we going to do? Let's figure out how to re-engineer the public sphere. So here are a few ideas. We need to redefine new criteria of evaluation so that we have a society that is more organized around a plurality of criteria of evaluation, which is why I call it from having to beings, so that we can be valued not only as workers but also as mothers. So how is it happening? Here I've listed a number of forms through which institutions can promote a plurality of kinds of excellence. So a few years ago, I was in charge of diversity at Harvard, and I came here on campus, and there were these beautiful banners at Stanford. Diversity and excellence go hand in hand. At Harvard at the time, we had banners that said, green is the new crimson, because we were in the middle of a sustainability campaign, whereas Stanford was really embracing this. So that was really a good example. But I don't have time to give you all these examples, but I can tell you that, for instance, legalization of gay marriage in 32 states has translated into a radical decline in number of suicides among LGBTQ youth in those 32 states, a decline of 7%. When employers promote work-family balance, they are circulating implicit messages about what is worthy. And so one strategy is this, looking at institutions to understand what are the implicit messages about cultural membership that they are diffusing. So we need to think much more systematically about the role of American higher education in promoting this, and the ways in which the youth is really asking, I think, for a far more multi-dimensional way of thinking about worth, as they are becoming quite critical of the American dream at the same time as many of them turn toward more, want to become tools and, think of themselves as using higher education just to gain more security. Another approach is to think about how to destigmatize groups that have been deeply stigmatized. So there's a paper I co-authored with 2 graduate students where we look at the process by which 3 groups that are unequally stigmatized have succeeded in becoming destigmatized. And we argue that it has required an alliance between professionals and knowledge workers and social movements. So we can also think about this kind of cultural, process to transform what is being said in the public sphere. And the third approach that I promote would be to try to study everyday universalism, not cosmopolitanism, I call it universalism, to really think about people. For the Daily Working Man, I did a lot of interviews with North African immigrants, blue-collar workers in France, and I asked them what makes people equal, and what they pointed to are, good and bad people in all races. We all spend 9 months in our mother's womb. We're all children of God. So we really need to understand far better how non-college educated people think about universalism and figure out how to make these themes far more salient into public sphere. So at the end of the day, I want to ask you and maybe other social scientists to engage with me in this exercise of thinking, what can we do to address the current moment of despair in American society, and how can we activate, what can we do to understand better how to diffuse different repertoires of hope to the population at large? So that's where I am now, and I welcome your comments.